So welcome back to Ask an Expert. This is the second to last of the webinars that we will be hosting in the series this year. My name is Tika Newton. I am the International Watershed Coordinator. I work with the Lake of the Woods Water Sustainability Foundation, the International Joint Commission, and many partners around the Rainy Lake of the Woods Basin, some of whom you are going to hear from today. I'll be hosting today's webinar. Sorry for the coughing that may interrupt us. I'll do my best here. I'm based in Kenora, Ontario, so coming to you as usual from my home. This is an area that's home to the Northwestern Ontario Métis, and it's the ancestral territory of the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3. It is pouring rain outside today after a heavy snowfall, so we're right into the thick of the transition season. But today we're going to hear all about fieldwork that happened during the summer and fall this year. Before we get started, I'll walk us through a bit of Zoom etiquette and some of the functions of this platform. I also want to remind you that the Ask an Expert series is an opportunity for those of us who work on watershed issues to share our work with the wider world and for you to ask us questions. Our hope is that by opening up these opportunities for discussion, we can learn from each other and strengthen the relationships we have to help us better care for this place that we all love so well. So far this year, we've recorded, I think, 3 webinars in the series. The first looked at watershed governance and understanding who does what in the watershed. Next, we looked at various community-led monitoring projects and programs and how we track aquatic invasive species. And more recently, we looked at some of the impacts of climate change to our basin. You can find recordings of all these webinars on our Lake of the Woods Water Sustainability Foundation website at lowwsf.com. Go to the Our Work header and then scroll down to Ask an Expert. I'll post the link in the chat as well in a moment. So let's quickly review some Zoom functions and etiquette for you. If you haven't used Zoom for a while or you're not familiar with it, if you're on a computer, you can access the taskbar by scrolling to the bottom of the screen. You'll see an option for your audio settings. That's the microphone in the lower left corner. You can mute and unmute yourself there. I should have you muted as you've come in, and you may actually not be able to access that function on your own. I'll have to check when I stop screen sharing here to make sure that, that you have that access, or if you don't, I can unmute you when the time comes. You can also choose whether you want to use your computer's audio settings or a headset. You can use the reaction button in the bottom to raise your hand to ask a question, or use the Q&A function, or write things in the chat. If the chat doesn't show up easily for you, you may have to go into the 3 dots that say more and look for it in there, but I think the chat should be enabled today. I'll do my best to keep an eye on the Q&A in the chat as we go, but we'll reserve time at the end of the webinar for doing some questions and answers and having a bit of discussion. Okay, so on with the webinar. So I'm going to introduce you to today's speakers in just a moment. But first, let's talk about what we're talking about today. So summer is a busy season for research scientists who study our watershed. During these few precious ice-free months, scientists get out in their boats and boots to measure temperature, chemistry, clarity, and other properties of water. They look at ecosystem changes, they track movement of invasive species of concern, and measure how native plants and animals are responding to changes in the environment. In any given field season, there are dozens of scientists active in the Rainy Lake of the Woods watershed, from the headwaters in northeastern Minnesota, through the boundary waters in Voyageurs National Park, and on into Rainy River and Lake of the Woods in Minnesota and Canada. These scientists are affiliated with universities and colleges, state, provincial, federal, and Indigenous government agencies, and with nonprofits and think tanks. In today's webinar, I'm joined by 3 researchers who have been actively working in the field this summer and fall. If you're interested in learning more about watershed science, I strongly encourage you to check out the International Rainy Lake of the Woods Watershed Forum. This is a 2-day science symposium that's hosted by the Foundation every March in International Falls, Minnesota. Registration is open now, and you can find more information on our website at lowwsf.com. So in a moment, I'm going to pass the mic to Shane Bowe and Dr. Adam Heathcote. Shane is the director of the Red Lake Band's Water Resources Program, and Adam is with the Science Museum of Minnesota's St. Croix Watershed Research Station. They work collaboratively on a number of projects of interest to the Red Lake Band. These include the study of algal toxins in the Lake of the Woods watershed, and also understanding the biology and ecology of wild rice in the tribe's territory in northwest angle of Lake of the Woods. After that, we'll hear from Anna Baker, who is a hydrologist with the United States Geological Survey, who will tell us about her work studying how stream sediments hold, carry, and release nutrients like phosphorus. Anna's work helps us to better understand how these nutrients, which can cause algae to flourish, are managed in nature. When do they become free-floating in the water column and therefore biologically available? And when are they bound up in ways that make them unavailable as building blocks for algae and other plants? This is sure to be a really interesting session. I hope you enjoy it. Remember to post your questions using the Q&A function or add comments in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on that. And now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Adam Heathcote.
Okay, thanks, Tika. So I have the pleasure of just giving a very brief introduction to the stuff that Shane and Ann are going to talk about. We have been working collaboratively, we being the Science Museum of Minnesota, in the Lake of the Woods Rain River Basin for over a decade now. That's work done by both myself as well as my colleague, Dr. Mark Edlin at the Science Museum of Minnesota. And, one of the things that I hope comes across from the presentations today is how important it is to collaborate in order to get anything done in this gigantic watershed and this gigantic lake that is Lake of the Woods. And so a lot of this
Adam,
stuff. Yep.
You are in presenter mode still. I don't know that matters, but if you want to switch out of presenter mode, you can. Yeah, that's better.
So do you see...
I still see you in presenter mode. That's fine. Carry on. We can make that work. That's fine.
That's interesting. Okay, well, I only have 6 slides, so it won't be a problem. Okay, so this is the work that we're talking about today. Had a whole bunch of people involved over many, many years. But I want to specifically talk about the collaboration between the Red Lake Department of Natural Resources, specifically Shane and Kayla Bowe, and the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, including Carrie Hernandez, Jesse Anderson, and Mike Kennedy. And then up and coming work with the USGS, which Anna will talk about. So when most people think of Lake of the Woods, they think of one of the world's greatest walleye fisheries, as well as general fisheries, a great place to fish both in the summer and the winter time. But when we as scientists studying Lake of the Woods, what we really think about is the kind of issues that continue to plague this lake. So most lakes in northern Minnesota or southern Canada, in this area we call the Canadian Shield or the subboreal forest, we think of as being relatively clean. However, Lake of the Woods has a long history of troublesome algae blooms, and the history of that is better understood. So we know that there was significant point source pollution to Lake of the Woods in most of the late 19th and mid 20th century. But we also know that all the partners in this watershed have done an outstanding job of really tamping down those point source pollution, specifically of phosphorus. And so whereas we know we have significantly decreased phosphorus loading to Lake of the Woods to almost what it was back in the 1800s, we still continue to see year after year these significant basin-wide algae blooms in the southern part of Lake of the Woods, which then flow north into Canada. So the question we're interested in is, why do these continue to happen, and what can we do to address this? And also, beyond just being a nuisance, is there actually a danger in terms of these algae? So do they produce the types of toxins that can be harmful to humans and wildlife? And if any of this is my shout out, if you don't subscribe to the EO Lake Watch, this is a product produced by Environment and Climate Change Canada from work by Dr. Karen Binding. You see that this problem persists, and this year is no exception. In fact, it's one of the worst blooms that we have seen since we've been able to monitor these basin-wide blooms using remote sensing. The red line there on that graph is 2023. The black line is the 20-year average, and you can see the 25th to 75th percentiles. We've actually gone above that in this year. So kind of the history of monitoring. The Science Museum, the Red Lake DNR, and PCA have sampled Lake of the Woods, at least the southern basin, going back to the project that started with Mark Edlin and I in 2015 and 2016. Environmental and Climate Change Canada took over between 2017 and 2018, and when they began to wrap up, we started again from 2019 to 2021, and then we were back out again this year in 2023. This is, to my knowledge, the longest continuous monitoring of the southern basin of Lake of the Woods. and also importantly includes winter measurements in each of these years. So we go out through the ice through all of our same sampling sites. We also added high frequency dissolved oxygen and temperature data, which was critical in terms of us understanding the physics of the southern basin of Lake of the Woods and how that might be affecting internal loading of phosphorus to the system. And also we had the first systematic measurements of cyanotoxins starting in 2019. So we measured a suite of toxins, the most commonly measured microcystin, which is a hepatotoxin, as well as anatoxin A, a neurotoxin, and cylindrospermopsin and saxitoxin, also neurotoxins, all produced by cyanobacteria that we see in Lake of the Woods. As I mentioned, we are out again this year. However, we don't have the data back because we actually just finished our last sampling 2 weeks ago. But the objectives of this work in 23 was to continue to promote cooperation between the Pollution Control Agency, Red Lake DNR, Science Museum, USGS, and many other partners in the watershed, to continue high frequency water quality monitoring. So by partnering between Red Lake and the Pollution Control Agency, we were actually out twice a month in this last year, and then also continuing that cyanotoxin data collection. So the 2019 through 2021 data, which the report should be out soon, showed that we do see above detection level and actually above drinking water recommendation levels of microcystin and anatoxin A quite frequently in Lake of the Woods during these peak blooms, and that's out in the middle. So if you think of when these blooms blow into shore, we would expect those concentrations to be much higher. Anna's going to talk about upcoming work tracking that legacy phosphorus, so that phosphorus that may be left over in the watershed from that historic pollution, both within the river network and the lake itself, and then also kind of interestingly pairing that work with stuff that's being done on the Red Lakes themselves, which are kind of a analogous large shallow lake basin. It really serves as an interesting comparison. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Shane Bowe from Red Lake Department of Natural Resources, who was actually the one out collecting samples all last year. Take it away, Shane.
Will do. Hopefully we got the right set showing here. All right, good afternoon, and thanks for inviting me to come and give a presentation. Thanks, Adam, for the introduction. I am Shane Bowe. I'm the Water Resources Director here for Red Lake Nation. And we've completed a number of monitoring projects on Lake of the Woods over the past couple of decades. And in most recent years, I've noticed that all of our projects have involved extensive partnerships, as Adam already mentioned. But in the past, this may not have been the case. Many of the projects we've worked on have involved the partners you're hearing from today are wonderful partners over at the Science Museum of Minnesota from the St. Croix Watershed Research Station, as well as partners at MPCA. And I apologize immediately to MPCA. I don't have your logo up here. I need to get it for my next presentation. But they've been a really excellent resource in helping us. They're helping us develop site-specific standards for Red Lake. They've helped us understand mechanisms on Lake of the Woods. And overall, they're just kind of a generally fun crew to work with. I promised Jeanette Marsh that I would not show a picture of her in my slideshow, and I am a man of my word. So please just take a look at that EPA emblem and imagine that Jeanette Marsh is peeking her head out from behind and doing great work from the shadows, because that's how she likes to operate. But really, I'm grateful to EPA for the funding that they've provided for the monitoring work that we've been doing. But in reality, if Jeanette weren't there, I'm fairly certain a lot of this work would have been greatly diminished. So just want to make sure I shout out to her. All right. So today we're highlighting some of the monitoring work we're doing on Lake of the Woods. Before we jump into that, I'm going to do my best to briefly explain why Red Lake Nation is even involved on Lake of the Woods. This is a question that I often get asked. I don't get asked it at presentations, and I don't get asked it typically in public. Usually it's asked after a couple of beers in the evening, and people build up their liquid courage and want to find out what the heck the tribe is doing up there. So I figured it would be best to just provide a brief presentation about that. To understand the interests of the tribe, we really need to cover sort of the shortest treaty history lesson that anyone has ever seen. A little bit of an explanation of the tribal lands on the northwest angle, and then that'll lead us to Red Lake Nation being signatory on the IMA, the International Multi-Agency Arrangement. And then I'm going to briefly cover the history of our program, the monitoring work we've done on Lake of the Woods, and then I'll finish up with a little description of the projects that we're working on this year. But I promise brevity. So here it goes. Tribal governments have been around longer than the United States has. They have been recognized in the US Constitution Therefore, land and resource exchanges with the US government take place through the negotiation of treaties. There's a long and sordid history of treaties with tribes in the US, and we're not delving deeply into them today, and it is not my area of expertise. But for this presentation, really what you need to know are these last 2 points. Treaties are how land exchange occurred, and anything not explicitly given up by treaty is retained. This means that when a tribe gave up title to an area, they did not, unless explicitly stated, give up rights to hunt, gather, travel, etc. in that area. So prior to 1863, on this map, you see a black outline of an area that the Red Lake and Pembina bands retained. In 1863, Alexander Ramsey, along with 300 soldiers and a Gatling gun, showed up to peacefully negotiate a treaty to conduct business in the area. Because this is the short version, I'm just going to suffice to say that the outcome was that the Red Lake lands were reduced by 11 million acres and were brought down to where you see the red line, and then from there to the east. This is called the 1863 Treaty, or the Old Crossing Treaty. So the new boundary established in 1863 is relevant to today's discussion because the tribe retained certain what are called usufructuary rights within this boundary, including but not limited to hunting and fishing. Note that this includes the entire northwest angle and the US portion of Lake of the Woods. And while the tribe has not extensively exercised those rights, they do assert that they retain those rights, and hence they have a great interest in restoring and protecting natural resources on Lake of the Woods. Obviously, fish, wild rice, wildlife don't do well if the water quality is poor. An interesting aside about the northwest angle, it exists in part because the negotiators of the Treaty of Paris in 1783 used this map in front of us of Lake of the Woods when they determined where the boundary between the US territory and British possessions would run. So Google the Mitchell map if you want to see the whole thing. It's actually very cool, but as you can see, it is not entirely accurate. So the new border, see if I can make this work. The new border would run through Lake of the Woods to the northwesternmost point, right here, thereof, and from thence on a due west course to the river Mississippi, which this is obviously problematic. The northwesternmost point of this very obviously oval-shaped lake of Lake of the Woods, and then west to the Mississippi that starts about 100 miles south and flows south. So there were some issues. Not to mention determining that northwesternmost point of the lake was quite a bugger. They did, after a couple of attempts, finally settle on a point about right here. And after a bunch of discussion, they eventually decided to go ahead and run it straight south to the 49th parallel. And that's where we end up with our little rabbit here on Minnesota. Zooming in a bit further to the northwest angle, we can see that the tribe retains trust lands covering the vast majority of the angle. So that's all the stuff that is in little red squares. These lands are still held by the tribe. If you'll note, the tribe does not own the shoreline. This is a bit more history, and I'm missing some of the details, but my understanding is that there was a project that was going to raise the water level of Lake of the Woods through a dam, and the federal government, through eminent domain, condemned the Red Lake lands that were going to be covered by water. The project fell through, and the lands were actually not covered by water. However, once it was scrapped, they did not return the lands to Red Lake. All right. This map shows lands currently owned by the Red Lake Nation. And so with these sort of legal and historical ties to the lake, when the international multi-agency arrangement was developed in 2009, the tribe became a signatory, and we've been working as partners on various projects ever since then. Hopefully that explains a little bit of why Red Lake Nation has a great interest in Lake of the Woods and its water quality. And so now I'm going to jump to some of the historical work that we've done on the lake. Our program has been actively monitoring Lake of the Woods and its tributaries at the northwest angle for quite some time. Jumping back to this map again, you'll see the sites we have been monitoring regularly since 2010. So these would be the sites right after the IMA was signed. Most of these sites are small streams leading from tribal trust lands into the lake. Prior to that, the tribe had collected data at some stream sites on the northwest angle as far back as 1999. Those site locations we determined not to be very useful, and they were revisited and revised in 2010. Data collected under these EPA-funded efforts were used to contribute to the Lake of the Woods TMDL study, and they also helped us develop what EPA calls a 9 known element watershed plan for the Angle, which can help us get funding for additional projects moving forward to work on like nutrient load reduction. In any given year, we continue to collect data at these sites as part of our base monitoring program. This year's no exception. The data we collect at these is sort of standard water quality data. Includes profiles for dissolved oxygen on the lake sites. We will collect pH, conductivity, temperature, total phosphorus, orthophosphorus, total suspended solids, sulfate, and a couple other things. All right, we're going to see if we can make this work. This was choppy earlier. So I have to say that the monitoring work that I have done on Lake of the Woods has been some of the absolute most rewarding and beautiful work I've ever done. Everything from the partnerships we've developed to the wild landscapes we've been able to experience, it has really left a lasting impression on me. This shows some video of the sites that we work on regularly at the Northwest Angle. The only way we can access them is to take a boat around the angle and then kayak upstream to our monitoring sites. It can make for some really long days on the water, especially if the wind's blowing upwards of 16 hours. But for some reason, no one ever feels bad for me, especially if I show them this video. I'm showing it now not to eat up time, not to take your attention away from my lack of preparation for this talk, but really just to show a little bit different perspective. We do think of Lake of the Woods a lot of the times as sort of a walleye factory, and there's a lot more resource out there that is worth protecting. I'm not going to show the whole video, it's 4 minutes long, but if anybody would like to see this in a little bit higher resolution, I can probably share a link at the end of this. So I and Adam both have mentioned partnerships a couple of times. I specifically mentioned working with the Science Museum staff. And as I was looking through images for this presentation, I just kept stumbling across pictures of them. It was like I was pulling out an old yearbook or seeing one of those Facebook memories reels or something. I met Mark and Adam at the Lake of the Woods Forum, actually. And I don't know if it was back in around 2014, but I'm actually not sure what year it was. From there, we started collaborating on work at Red Lake and Lake of the Woods. And so here we are in 2016, taking some sediment cores on Red Lake. Here we are in 2017, doing the exact same thing. And in 2018, finally in 2019, we got to do some work on Lake of the Woods together. Later in 2019, I got to come rescue them off Lake of the Woods on a pretty cold day. And in 2021, here we are collecting samples at Lake of the Woods again. I don't have any pictures of us together from this year because we didn't do any work at the same time this year. So now I'm going to move on to current projects and the things we've been working on in 2023. You've already heard from Adam, the aforementioned dark side of Lake of the Woods. This is a picture of this year's algal bloom. It was pretty bad. Without getting too sciencey, we are working on an algal toxins project on Lake of the Woods, again with a number of partners. Funding is coming from both the US EPA and the MPCA. Significant expertise and analysis is coming from the Science Museum. Red Lake is kind of the conduit through which the EPA is able to use some of their funds to fund the work that we are doing. We are collecting about half of the data. And Adam kind of went over this already, but I'll just describe it again. The previous work on Lake of the Woods suggested that there's at least potential that changes in the nitrogen phosphorus ratio through nutrient reductions might actually increase toxins in the lake. In other words, the good work that we do that may reduce phosphorus in the lake doesn't necessarily reduce nitrogen at the same rate. And some nitrogen limited species of cyanobacteria might actually flourish under those conditions, which could cause an increase in toxin levels, even while it causes an overall decrease in phosphorus and associated algal blooms. Working with partners, we determined that our best course of action was to conduct this enhanced monitoring project that we're working on. The enhancements would occur at 4 sites, and we would add 6 sampling events. MPCA would be matching that result in a total of 12 site visits at each site, and we'd end up with approximately bi-weekly data. The weather on Lake of the Woods and logistics aren't always cooperative, so sometimes we didn't get our 2-week spread, but we did a pretty good job. Here you can see the 4 additional sites, and Adam already showed these, but I'll just point at them since my map is a little bit noisier than his was. These are the ones we added to our base monitoring scheduled, located in the southern portion. So what did we collect? I feel like we collected all the stuff. At least it feels that way. We sampled 4 cyanotoxins Adam mentioned: microcystin, anatoxin, saxitoxin, and cylindrospermopsin. We collected lake profiles at each site, including standard parameters plus relative fluorescence to estimate chlorophyll A and blue-greens. Integrated samples included that large suite of parameters there that I won't read off. It feels like all the stuff. We really collected a lot of data this year. And we hope that this work on Lake of the Woods and on Red Lake, upon which we are collecting an identical suite of parameters, will be able to help determine the best steps moving forward with respect to nutrient load reduction strategies. All the samples are still being analyzed, so we don't have any exciting data slides to share, although at the end, perhaps Adam can share some preliminary results if he has any. One of the other projects we're working on is wild rice assessment around the Northwest Angle. Wild rice is one of the resources that is of great spiritual and cultural importance to tribal members. The rice stands around the angle are immense, but we don't really have any historical monitoring data. They're also really difficult to access. So in cooperation with a wild rice consortium working across Minnesota and the Minnesota DNR and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, we are collecting data that we hope to use to develop a remote sensing tool for wild rice estimation. Now, I am not deeply involved in the remote sensing portion of this project, so I can't really describe how that's going to occur. Suffice to say, it uses computers and is essentially magic. So at our base monitoring sites, we're manually collecting rice density data. Here's Sonny Johnson, an apprentice in our program and a tribal member, out collecting some of that data. While we are out collecting the data on a random grid, the drone flies overhead and collects imagery. That imagery is later georectified. We intend to share it with a larger consortium who will do the magic part. The drone imagery is much higher resolution than what we get from satellite or FSA imagery. As you can see, as we zoom in, the details are really quite apparent. Density estimates should be a real possibility from these images. And in some cases, we can even count stems. The question remains whether or not we can build a remote sensing tool that is effective, but at a minimum, we can provide an annual estimate using the drone imagery. And because of the accessibility issues at this site, the drone can be a real help to us. The data from this project is also being worked up, and since it is wild rice data, it is a bit more sensitive with respect to sharing it publicly, so I won't have any data slides here either. But hopefully this gives you an idea of the wild rice work that we're doing. So that's all for current projects on Lake of the Woods. I do want to just quickly circle back to partnerships and collaboration. They have been essential to every single project that we have completed on Lake of the Woods. More than that, I feel like they actually open new doors for us. I mean, you gain partners when you do projects with them, but you also get new project ideas from those partners, and it seems to be a positive feedback loop. Once you collaborate once, you tend to collaborate over and over again. And then just a few notes about collaborating with tribes, because this is another one of those questions I often get after a couple of beers. First of all, I think our partners on these projects have done these things wonderfully, and I want to thank them for that. But I want to share these, what I think are simple pieces of advice for anyone who's considering reaching out to tribes. First, please get in touch with technical staff if they exist. We are the staff you will end up working with when you partner with a tribe. Still go ahead and send that letter to the council or the chairman or whoever's been identified as a point of contact for the tribe, but definitely get in touch with the technical staff. Next, talk early. And by early, I mean before you have a project in mind, not halfway through your field season or even as you're developing a project. It would be great to reach out to your counterparts at local tribal agencies and see who's there. What are their priorities? What are their needs? What are their ideas? What kind of input might they have? Maybe they'll come to you with a project. And then third, please pick up the phone. An email from a person I've never heard of just gets lumped in with the other 500 emails from that week. Give us a call, stop by, find us at a conference. Personal communication is always better. And finally, all tribes are different. They have their own governments and policies, but I think contacting staff early on will help you understand what these differences are and how to navigate them. And with that, I just want to say thank you one more time to all our partners. And again, I apologize to MPCA because I didn't get that logo up there. Hopefully some of them are on the call and they can berate me later. And now I'm going to be turning things over to Anna Baker with USGS, who's going to be discussing the work she's doing on Lake of the Woods and Rainy River. If I can figure out how to unshare my screen.
Let's see if this works.
There's stop share. It went to the other screen.
Okay, are you seeing my screen now?
Yep, looks good, Anna.
Perfect, okay. Alrighty. Okay, thanks so much, Shane, for the great presentation, and thanks, Tika, for the introduction, and Adam for kicking us off. My name's Anna Baker. I'm a hydrologist with the U.S. Geological Survey, and I'm excited to be with you all today to provide an update on our 2023 field season. We have this collaborative project that was put together with partners shown at the bottom of the screen here. Our study is funded by the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund and was built in partnership with Minnesota Pollution Control Agency to try and help provide them with information that would support their implementation of total maximum daily load regulations that have been established for Lake of the Woods to set goals for the state of Minnesota to reduce nutrients so that we can hopefully reduce algal blooms in tandem with that. So very grateful to be working with the folks from St. Croix Watershed Research Station, NPCA, and several of the soil and water conservation districts in the lower Rainy River area, so Koochiching, Lake of the Woods, and North St. Louis counties. And we also have an advisor who is on the proposal with us from Environment Climate Change Canada. So the folks who are in the field this season are all listed in bold here, and just big shout out and thanks to all of the folks who put this study together with us. So just a little bit of background, and Adam touched on a lot of this in his presentation, but just to kind of give you the framework of how our study was put together. So algal blooms threaten the Lake of the Woods ecosystem for a couple of reasons. First, that when algae bloom in excess, their decomposition can deplete dissolved oxygen levels. So that can impact where fish and other aquatic life are able to be within the lake ecosystem at certain times of year. Also, another concern with algal blooms is that they're capable of producing toxins, which both Adam and Shane talked about their collaborative work looking at algal toxins, and we'll greatly look forward to seeing the results of that in coming seasons. So what's driving these algal blooms? It's a combination of many factors. Light and temperature are important, and we tend to look at excess nutrients as being one of the primary issues that drives blooms and that we might be able to have some influence over. So those nutrients include carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, and there have been studies that have been done in fresh waters, particularly at Experimental Lakes area in Ontario and also in Treaty 3 area, that have shown that phosphorus can be limiting, which means when phosphorus is in excess, it can really stimulate algae to bloom. So a lot of the work that has gone into trying to reduce blooms, not just in the Lake of the Woods region, but around the world in freshwaters, has focused on phosphorus. And when we think about managing phosphorus, we also have to think about kind of managing sediment, or at least understanding how phosphorus is binding to sediment. Phosphorus readily attaches to sediment, so their management is often kind of done in tandem. A study that was done in 2011 looked at the balance of phosphorus coming into the Lake of the Woods system and moving through. And that study found that as much as 75% of new inputs of phosphorus to Lake of the Woods are coming from Rainy River. So we designed this study around looking at inputs of phosphorus from the Rainy River and how they are moving with sediment through that system. And this is really driven by questions from our partners from the resource management community, Minnesota Pollution Control, and the local soil and water conservation districts. And they had a few questions that they needed help with in order to move forward their implementation of those total maximum daily load regulations, which set the targets for phosphorus levels for Lake of the Woods. So what they're curious about includes how much phosphorus is stored in Rainy River sediments and would be making its way kind of slowly through the corridor of the river. How much new phosphorus is coming in from tributaries in Minnesota? We have some large tributaries on the Minnesota side that produce a lot of sediment and can disproportionately contribute phosphorus. And they're also interested in how likely it is that that sediment-bound phosphorus may actually serve to fuel algal blooms. So that's kind of a complex issue and relates to how sediment is bound to phosphorus and how likely it is to become released in a dissolved form that can stimulate algal growth. So these are the questions that our study was designed around. So our study includes kind of a three-tiered approach. The first component of it is to map streambed fine sediment deposits and assess their phosphorus storage. The second part is to assess new inputs of sediment-bound phosphorus from tributaries in Minnesota. And third, we'll be looking at the history of sediment-bound phosphorus deposition in 4 Mile Bay. So that'll be using long cores like the type that you saw in Shane's presentation that have been taken by St. Croix Watershed Research Station in Red Lake over the course of time. And that'll help connect the history of this river mouth environment to the history of Lake of the Woods. So the location of our study area spans from downstream of Rainy Lake all the way through 4 Mile Bay. And the river mapping efforts will be concentrated along this dark blue lower Rainy River and 4 Mile Bay section. And then we have 7 tributary monitoring locations. 6 of them are pictured here. 3 of those locations are on tributaries in Minnesota. So Little Fork River, Big Fork River, and Rapid River each have a monitoring station. And then we'll be looking at inputs coming into this area with a station on Rainy at International Falls. And in the middle of the Rainy at Manitou Rapids, kind of bracketing the Little Fork and Big Fork inputs. And then downstream, we'll have one actually at Baudette and then one down at Wheeler's Point near the mouth of the river. So today I'll provide an update on where we are with these 2 facets of the study. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about a really important aspect of working in the Rainy Lake of the Woods Basin that Shane gave us a great presentation on from the perspective of Red Lake Nation. And that is just the fact that we are in truly multinational waters when we're working in Rainy River and Lake of the Woods. So even though our study is funded by state of Minnesota dollars, we immediately realized that we needed to be working with tribal and First Nations communities who call this region home and who have rights to these waters. So our work began with outreach to Red Lake Nation, Bois Forte Band of Chippewa, and many of the First Nations within the Treaty 3 area. And we were really fortunate to work with Grand Council Treaty 3 on this. They helped provide us with a lot of insight and resources and helped us understand who we should reach out to and who is in closest relationship to this part of the river and lake where we would be working. So this offered us incredible opportunities to learn about tribal and First Nations relationship with these waters, opportunities to learn and engage by attending and presenting on our study at treaty organization events, such as the Environmental Stewardship Gathering that Grand Council Treaty 3 hosted last March. We've also been really honored to have opportunities to meet with elder councils and lands and resources staff from these communities. And moving forward, we're hoping to learn and grow from this towards understanding and incorporation of Indigenous knowledge systems, working in parallel with Indigenous knowledge systems and building towards collaboration. So really amazing opportunity that we have had to build towards partnerships here. So jumping back to kind of a field season update, this season we started just working in the Minnesota tributaries that have existing monitoring. So we started out with just testing some field methods and collecting some preliminary samples in these tributaries. And this is in partnership with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's Watershed Pollutant Load Monitoring Program. They have a suite of parameters for which they work up loads each year. And we added to this by adding additional suspended sediment sampling. So here we're trying to collect enough material that we can look at the concentration of phosphorus on sediment moving through these river systems. So here you see pictured a passive sampler that allows the water to flow through, and as it flows through, the water slows down and the sediment settles out. So we collect water with passive samplers during the open water season, and when the water is particularly high during the early spring, we collect water streamside and allow it to settle in buckets. So here's an example from Little Fork River. We then have to isolate the suspended sediment that's in this water. So we centrifuge it down, and huge shout out to our collaborators from the Soil and Water Conservation Districts of Lake of the Woods and Koochiching County for all of their efforts in supporting this sampling and working out these methods with us. We also added water quality parameters so that we would have a full suite of phosphorus and nutrient chemistry, as well as chlorophyll at each of these sites. So then after a kind of full season of engagement, we started working in the Rainy River this fall, and we actually just completed our beginning of our mapping efforts about 2 weeks ago as well. So our mapping began with looking at the stream bed sediments and their extent and thickness. So the goals of this part of the study were to evaluate stream bed soft sediment deposits. So this is the really fine grained materials, silt and clay, and deposits that are really soft and potentially mobile, which means they would be easily resuspended during high stream flows. It's the kind of material that if you stepped in it, you would sink into it. It's really soft. So we're looking for those kind of sediments because they hold a lot of phosphorus. And we're looking to delineate the deposit extent and the thickness so that we can estimate a volume of stored sediment within those mapped areas. And then next season, we will be sampling in order to assess phosphorus content of those fine-grained sediments. And we'll look at the detailed phosphorus chemistry so that we can get a better understanding of its potential to contribute to internal loading or the slow release of bioavailable phosphorus downstream in Lake of the Woods. So before we go out in the field and map, we do some mapping exercises in the office. So this effort was focused on identifying areas where we thought that soft sediment may occur. And that was based on a few different factors, the main one being water velocity. So we were really lucky to have some data sets provided to us by Environment Climate Change Canada. They have a HEC-RAS model of the lower Rainy River, and they actually ran 2 scenarios for us so that they could provide us with velocity fields so that we could see what the velocity of the water is at a very dense grid across the river. So they ran a scenario for us that was representative of spring 2023 flows, and they also did an average low flow scenario. So when we were looking at this data, we were looking for areas where the velocity was less than 30 centimeters per second. And this was based on field observations from previous studies at other rivers in the upper Midwest, where it was observed that fine sediments were deposited where the velocities were less than 30 centimeters per second. We also used the bathymetry. A lot of the soft sediment occurs in shallower, quieter areas of the river. And we also looked at vegetation distribution, as the vegetation tends to prefer certain types of sediment. So getting out into the field, we had a bunch of different instruments that we used to try and look at the sediment texture and the deposit extent and the thickness. So out there, we were using a side scan sonar. This is a pretty common piece of equipment that you may have heard referred to as a fish finder. So that gives us kind of an image of the subsurface. We also had visual observations of texture at a network of locations where we were taking hand cores with a device like this, where the water was shallow enough, and also soundings using a much longer sounding pole. We also measured sediment thickness using manual measurements with a long sounding rod. And we also were using 2 different geophysical instruments to look at sediment thickness. And those included a seismic chirp or sub-bottom profiler. That's a sonar-based instrument. And we also used a ground penetrating radar. And the combination of the 2 of those was designed to try and get at the thickness of these soft sediments. So the data that we collected included a large network of manual sounding points, and we got only just a very small handful of preliminary samples at these sites. I think we came away with less than 10 samples. The focus of this trip really was to get a great distribution of information about the sediment deposit extent and thickness. So we had a laptop set up on the boat that had a differential GPS connected to it and was tracking our location the whole time. So we were able to map these points on the fly, and we were recording the thickness of the sediment texture, and the type of vegetation. The GPR and seismic data that we collected were along traces that you see pictured here in yellow, and the GPR and seismic both kind of look just directly down beneath the boat. So we are just at the very, very beginning stages of working up this data. This is an example of a GPR trace from a previous study where you can see different layers of contrasting sediment properties. So we will be working towards having data that describes sediment thickness. A very, very preliminary output, as we've been kind of pulling this data together since getting out of the field, is here at the left. And this is showing our manual soundings and the thickness of sediment that was measured. And we're starting to see that there might be some relationship between the thickness of sediment. So here, these dark green points are showing that there was thick, soft sediment in this part of 4 Mile Bay. And we're also seeing in the chirp seismic hardness coefficient that may correlate. So looking forward to digging into this data set and seeing what we can learn about how these sediments are deposited throughout the Rainy River and 4 Mile Bay. We also collected side scan sonar, and we did 3 passes of the river. And in particular, we were working mostly downstream of Long Sault Rapids for folks who are familiar with that location on the Rainy. The slope of the channel is lower there, and there's more accumulation of soft sediment. So we did 3 passes there. And part of the reason why we had to do multiple passes, this instrument looks out 180 degrees, but it only gets good data kind of within a certain distance of the instrument. So you can see here that there's kind of noisy data at the edges. There's a muted signal just beneath where the boat was passing. So the boat's kind of traveling down the center of this image here. And then we have really nice data here on either side of the boat and showing this image of sand dunes. So this will help us kind of identify where areas of sand versus boulders versus potential soft sediment are occurring and how extensive they are. So some of our big picture observations from this initial trip in the beginning of our mapping efforts, we saw a lot of soft sediment was occurring downstream of Long Sault Rapids, as I mentioned, and especially downstream of Baudette River. So this is the part of the system that has the lowest slope and also that has the most influence of backwater from Lake of the Woods. We saw a strong relationship between soft sediment and vegetation, especially wild rice. So the soft sediment, wild rice tended to occur in soft sediment. And we often saw this on shelves on the side of the river. So these areas that you see that are kind of bright white yellow here on the sides of the channel are very shallow, less than 5 feet. And then there's a steep drop off to areas that are greater than 15 feet. We also saw this relationship in 4 Mile Bay. We also looked a little bit at the potential for mobilization, and we observed that waves were resuspending this soft, fine-grained material along the banks of the river, mostly in areas where the vegetative cover wasn't super dense. So where we're headed next, following this field season, we'll be working up the side scan sonar, GPR, and seismic data. We'll be generating maps of the sediment deposit extent and thickness based on those manual soundings, the side scan sonar, GPR, and hopefully we'll get to use that seismic reflection or hardness coefficient that I showed in that initial map. Next season, we are looking forward to doing our stream bed sediment and water sampling along the mapping transect. And we'll also be doing tributary monitoring. We'll kind of make the full monitoring program live, and we'll start working at the locations on the Rainy River. So we'll have especially high density sampling during snow melts, because that's when we see the biggest movement of sediment and phosphorus. We'll also be carrying out the long core collection on 4 Mile Bay, and that will be led by our collaborators from St. Croix Watershed Research Station. And we also are looking forward to continuing collaboration and outreach, and hopefully building on relationships that we've started building in these initial stages of the project with tribes, First Nations, partners within the US and Canada. So with that, I just want to say a big thank you to all of our collaborators, to Grand Council Treaty 3 for all of their coordination, and to everybody who has contributed on this project. And with that, I will hand it back to Tika, and we'll look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Anna and Shane and Adam. Those were amazing presentations. It's so much fun for me to get to host these. I usually go into them thinking I know what everybody's working on and talking about, and then I learn all kinds of new things that I didn't know. So it's pretty wonderful. For those of you watching in the audience, if you have a question, feel free to post it right now. You can use the Q&A function at the bottom, or you can type it into the chat, or you can raise your hand and I will unmute you and let you ask your question. But I have a couple, I guess, to get us started. So Anna, it's interesting looking at that color-coded map that you just shared in one of your last images there of the profile of the Rainy River, where those soft sediments occur. Those are, you know, right in those riparian areas that are probably most subject to pretty significant fluctuations in water level from year to year. 2023 was a pretty dry year. Last year, they would have been well underwater. I wonder if you can say anything about what your expectations are, or whether you're looking at the impacts of inundation and water levels changes to sedimentation and phosphorus dynamics.
Such a great question, Tika. We were really pleased that the areas that we were working in were underwater. We were actually not sure if some of them might be completely exposed. And in the upstream of Manitou Rapids section of the Rainy, the river mouths of Little Fork and Big Fork and Black River had a lot of exposed sediment that would normally have been underwater. But the question of how water levels impact the sediment transport is a really great one. Our study doesn't have a component that is actually doing anything experimental to look at that mobilization, but because we're out mapping this season and we'll be out collecting samples next season, that may give us an opportunity to see how things compare during different water levels. So yeah, I think that's a really great and important question. We did, in addition to mapping in that area that is downstream of Long Sioux Rapids, we also did map in the river mouths of Little Fork, Big Fork, and Black River, and Rapid, but that was actually underwater, so that was helpful. So we'll be interested to see kind of what when we actually connect the dots and extrapolate what we were seeing in terms of sediment texture. It'll be really interesting to see what was there.
Yeah, I agree. I think it'll be really interesting to keep in mind. So a project that wasn't discussed today, but that is just getting started, partly in partnership with the IMA that Shane talked about, is the second phase of the Objectives and Alerts project. So the purpose of this one is to provide recommendations to government to establish water quality objectives for phosphorus along the transboundary. That's one part of the project. And we know we're going to have to set up a long-term monitoring or make recommendations for a long-term monitoring program that would support knowing how we're progressing toward achieving water quality objectives, or when we're exceeding alert levels and that sort of thing. So it'll be really interesting to keep tabs on what you discover in the next couple of years with this study, and then use that to inform some of the design for the long-term study of water quality objectives, I think. So that's really cool. Mark Edlund has posted a couple of questions in the Q&A here. Shane did answer one of them online, but I think maybe for the benefit of folks who are in the audience, Mark had asked what time of year they're doing the drone and remote sensing development for wild rice census. Shane just answered here. The year was August. It was in August of 2020, 2021. They're looking for mature rice, so that's in August.
Actually, that was August 20th and 21st.
Oh, I see.
I shouldn't have put it that way. My bad.
Okay, got it. Okay, that was this year. Right. That makes sense. Yeah. Anything else you wanted to add to that, Shane? Okay. And then Mark has a question for you too, Anna. How is the GPR unit deployed from a boat? Is it towed behind? How close to the sediments do you need to be to get good data?
Thanks for the question, Mark. The GPR unit was towed alongside the boat, and we had both the GPR and seismic unit out to try and help kind of address the fact that each works differently in terms of how much interference there is from the water column and how deeply they can penetrate into the sediments. If I'm remembering correctly, the GPR worked better in shallower water, but I might be remembering that backwards. So our expert on the GPR and seismic is Colin Rowland. And actually Colin Rowland and Paul Renaud were our two folks who were running those two instruments. So I would be happy to reach back out to you with lots more details about which one was functioning better in deeper versus shallower water.
Thanks, Anna. Okay, I'll give one last call for questions here. If anybody has one, feel free to ask. And if not, I am just going to quickly put up this last slide here because it has, let me see if I can get that quick. It has the link right there to the Ask an Expert series. So if you want to check out past recordings, this one will also go online there. Maybe later today, we'll see how quickly I can get the video processed. But we're also doing a session at the end of the month, November 27th, to recap the year in international watershed coordination, looking at a whole bunch of projects that have happened. And then looking ahead to 2024 as well. A number of the projects that we've discussed today are actually feeding into or somehow related to projects we'll be talking about on the November 27th session and things that we're building for next year. So for example, there's a project that we just started to do full bathymetry data collection for the Lower Rainy River and 4 Mile Bay. So Anna's work that she described is providing some of that information, but we're doing a slightly more comprehensive study, and that information will then feed into models that anyone can use. So it can be used for Anna's research and others in the future. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of weeks. I don't see any further questions popping up, so I'm going to take this opportunity to thank all three of you for fantastic presentations today. I learned a lot. I was entertained. It was great. Thank you so much. I hope you have a great afternoon and take care. We'll see you soon. Bye, everyone.